I'm Laura Richardson with Relevate, and we're bringing you another episode of I'm Moving to North Carolina, Now What? So today's topic has to do with inherited property. So typically when a property becomes inherited, so you found out that this property is now in your name, your ownership, and that sort of thing, it is a stressful time period because usually you are also dealing with the emotional loss while having to navigate where is certain paperwork, who's responsible for what, do I even legally have the right to sell this property or do anything to the property? And there are definitely a lot of layers here. So before we get started, I will highly recommend that if you do not have the proper paperwork, you go talk to somebody in the legal world, so an attorney who actually specializes in estates, wills, and trusts, and you talk to them about what the best next steps are. Because it's really going to depend on what paperwork is available to what pathway is the best choice. This is also going to feed into questions that your agent asks you, or even the timing of things. I have seen some of these projects take up to a year or even more when the paperwork hasn't been in place from the get-go. So as another pro tip here, before you get to this stage, always make sure that you have necessary POAs, so power of attorney, in place. In addition to, if you know that you are getting to that stage of life and there are other people who will be bequeathed this property or other things along with it, it's really good to go ahead and start that paperwork trail so that they're not having to deal with the aftermath should something happen. So without further ado, here are a couple of tips on how to deal with an inherited property. So what do you do with it? Well, first step, we need to find out who all the beneficiaries are. One of the tricky things about the state of North Carolina, there's this rule of thumb, 1 to buy, 2 to sell. So let's say, for example, I inherit a property. I am married, so therefore my spouse is also going to be a beneficiary. Even if he is not named, he has a marital vested interest in this property now because of our relationship. So it's really important that if you get a property, you start breaking out your family tree, which can be a little dangerous sometimes, right? Because everybody has that crazy Aunt Sally that they don't even talk to anymore, that all of a sudden she's involved. Then you also get into a little bit of a tricky situation when there's siblings and some of those siblings have passed. So for example, if grandpa passes, and so it goes down to, let's say, the 6 siblings in that family, each sibling's partner or spouse is now involved. But if one of those siblings has also passed away, it now goes to their children and their spouses. So you can see how this becomes kind of a crazy web to be wove. So it's really important. Family trees, get all that mapped out. Know if someone is married or somebody else has passed, how that family tree kind of matriculates down. The second big one is, are there any liens against the property? So we're going to do a whole nother video on liens so that you understand the different types of liens that are available there. So please be sure to check that out. But this big thing about liens is that it attaches to the property, not the individual person. So for example, let's say that you buy a house and the previous seller not only has a mortgage, but also has a lien for, let's say, a HELOC, so a home equity line of credit. And the attorney only finds the primary mortgage, and that's the only one that gets paid off. Well, now the buyer goes to sell this house later. That original HELOC is still attached to the property. So keep in mind that all of these things, these financial obligations, these debts have to be cleared. And you can have a ton of different types of liens. There can be construction liens. There can actually be, basically anybody can put a lien on something, but you have to have a clear pathway before you sell the property. So debts have to be paid prior to any sale. They also have to be disclosed if you take the house to market. The third thing is having a POA and an executor or executress. So the tricky thing with this, with POAs, is often people might be responsible for the estate, but the way the paperwork is written, it doesn't necessarily give them the ability to sell real property, i.e. real estate. So it's really important that you have a real estate attorney review the paperwork in addition to the person who's dealing with the trusts, wills, and estates and all that good stuff. Because the POA, so to sign a listing agreement, to actually sign on the deed, to sell the property and sign settlement statements, all of that, the POA has to have the ability to actually sign those documents. So it can get a little tricky. What if there isn't a POA? What if there isn't an executor? So then you have to kind of come up with who's going to be the leader of this ship. So just know that Every estate situation is going to be very, very different. Anytime there's inherited property, there's not necessarily a blueprint that says this is step one, two, and three. It's kind of like if you ever remember those choose your own adventure books as a kid, where you get to the end of the chapter and it says, if you want to do this, go to page 20. If you want to do this, go to 45. It's literally the same thing. So just know that these are all tips and advice based on a generic situation. So you're going to have to choose your own path here. The fourth thing is doing a really good title search and a deed history. One of the other things that can happen, especially with family or generational property, is you see where property has either gotten recombined or subdivided, or it's gotten passed down through all these different types of deed transfers over the course of time. And we have seen like one of the craziest scenarios is where you have one parcel of land, but it's got multiple addresses on it. So same 1 acre, but you've got Susie and Tommy that live at 8903, and then you've got Billy and Bobby that live over here at 8904. So when you sell the property, you're selling two different homes in addition to the parcel itself. And we've seen where people try to sell the address versus the actual parcel, the PIN and the ID. So you want to make sure that you're checking that title search, that deed, looking at any secondary or tertiary structures that are on the property, and that you really have a good kind of looking at it from 30,000 square feet. An overview of the property. So contacting an attorney that can do this title search for you is always good. And then the fifth thing is based on the paperwork, does the property have to be publicly sold? So a lot of times when you're dealing with probate, there is a process and it's like a 10-day upset bid period. So you have to publicly post in the newspaper that this property is going for sale. That's to allow, we mentioned liens earlier, that's to allow any debts to be called in so that they can be settled at the closing table. So that's part one. And then the other thing is you have to publicly post it downtown in the courthouse. So it does seem a little old school because if you think about it, everything's so digital and technology based now. So the thought of even having to post something in the newspaper seems a little obscure. But here we are. This is how we do things. This is not just North Carolina. This is kind of how we do things across the board with real estate. So we want to make sure that we understand if there is a bidding process, because that bidding process can actually compound and become rather long-winded. So in that 10 days, anybody can put in what's called an upset bid on the property, and now they're the lead buyer. And until that closes out, you don't actually construct a contract. All of this is based on how the paperwork of the inherited property was received. And then there's also some other tricks and stuff that kind of come with that your attorney can advise you on. So just make sure you get all of your documents tackled, completed before anybody passes away. Have a will outlined of what to do if something does happen, the benefits of having a trust versus a will, and making sure everything is spelled out so that your bereaved loved ones do not have to sort this out on their own. If you have any questions about this process or need a good recommendation for a local attorney, please drop those in the comments below. And until next time, I'm Laura Richardson with Relevate. We'll see you on the next episode.